Let me go back to your question because there's another implication of this. You asked, what are the implications of being an apologist and being a Calvinist?
Yeah.
For me, I've noticed that when Calvinists who are apologists try and answer questions regarding evil, they can't give a robust answer.
I know we have friends, we have mutual friends that we've met with and worked with recently in a mutual conference together who we love, who lean Calvinistically and are unapologetically call themselves Calvinists. And we work together side by side to teach people apologetics, in fact. So does it really matter what you believe about free will, predestination, Calvinism or not, when you're doing apologetics?
Yeah, well, ironically, let me go back to something you said earlier. Ironically, I think that Calvinists don't take God's sovereignty seriously enough. Why? Because I think that God is so sovereign that he can get his will done through our free will. And apparently Calvinists don't think that. Calvinists think, oh, if God is sovereign, he can't give us free will. Or at least he can't give us free will when it comes to choosing whether or not we're saved. I've heard R.C. Sproul, whom I loved, by the way. I listen to R.C. Sproul all the time. But I heard him saying that, yeah, we do have free will, except when it comes to choosing whether or not we're Christians. I'm thinking, what? That's like the most important decision we can make. And that's the one thing that we can't choose. Well, why is that? I don't understand. Do you think that God is not sovereign enough to get his will done through our free will?
Yeah, that's really a good way of putting it.
Yeah, I think he is sovereign enough to do that. But let me go back to your question. Why does it matter? We've had conversations with mutual friends, as you've said. And to be honest about looking at the scriptures, I think Calvinists can make a case from the scriptures and interpret them in a Calvinistic way. I don't think they're totally out to lunch when they do that. But what I do say to them is, yeah, you could interpret it that way. I think you're interpreting it wrongly when you interpret it that way, but you could make a case to interpret it that way. But why would you interpret it that way when it makes God the author of evil, because now we don't have free choice and God makes all our choices, including our choice to do evil, and secondly, takes away the free will of man. When you see other passages that say God wants all to be saved and, I don't know about you, but in my house, we're going to choose the Lord. And, in verses like this or passages like this, which seem to take away all human responsibility away. Why would you interpret it in a way that makes God the author of evil and takes human responsibility away? I don't get that, because you can easily interpret it in what I think is the proper way to say that, yes, God chooses. We all know God chooses. That's unavoidable, Leighton, as you know. It's unavoidable that God makes choices. And when he knows all things, and when he chooses to create this universe, he is going to choose the outcome because he knows how it's going to turn out. But as we said earlier, that doesn't mean he's taking away our free will. Yes, he chooses, but we still freely do what we do.
Yeah, and I know a lot of Calvinists will kind of redefine free will in such a way as to say, it's called compatibilism, that God's determinism is true. God determines everything, but that's compatible with human freedom.
How?
Human responsibility.
How?
And what they do is they say, well, freedom is defined as long as you're doing what you want to do. Now, underneath that is obviously God's the one who determines what you want to do in any given circumstance that God determines.
So it's not really free will.
Yeah, it's a non-free free will is what Kilden Wilson, who I'm having on Monday, he that's what he calls it. It's a non-free free will. They call it compatibilistic free will instead of libertarian free will, and that's why we have all these terms in the philosophical world, because you've got to be able to define these things. But I don't. Whenever you define free will that way, as long as you're doing what you want, you're free and you're responsible, even though God has determined what you want to do, and you're just not supposed to ask any questions. And if you do ask, well, then why are we to be blamed for that? That's when they quote, Romans 9 at you. Out of context, in my estimation, because they say, well, that's exactly what the interlocutor in Paul's mind is asking. Why are we to be blamed for doing what he has created us and molded us as a potter to do? And then, of course, I've got to go back over the lesson in Romans 9 as to what Paul is actually talking about: a rebellious, hardened Israelite, not somebody who was born a reprobate, and they were cut off because of their unbelief and being hardened judicially by God to bring about the crucifixion and the ingrafting of the Gentiles. It's not about reprobation. It's about judicial hardening of Israel. And once I explain that, then the back and forth fireworks over how do you interpret this text comes apart. But I think you said something really important. I want to hone in on this. If you have two viable options in front of you, two viable interpretations in front of you, one of which has actually been more popular throughout Christian history among scholars, namely the view that we hold to, the more free will perspective, if you will, has always been more popular throughout church history than the more predestinarian or the deterministic kind of interpretations. If you have both of those in front of you and you're actually studying the best of both scholars from both sides, why would you choose the one that seems to make God the author of sin, that seems to impugn his character, that seems to possibly undermine other very strong texts that indicate God's frustration for when we don't choose to follow him, and the wrath of God and the punishment of God for doing things that he's supposedly determined for you to do that you couldn't help?
I don't know why
seems,
I was going to say, I don't know why they choose it, Leighton. I can speculate. It might be because it's easier, right? And it might easier in the sense that, well, look, these people are just on their way to hell. There's nothing I can do about it. I'll throw a Bible verse at them, see if maybe they'll respond. I don't know if they're elect or not, but gee, if they don't respond, I guess they're just not elect. So I don't really have the motivation for evangelism like I should, right? If that's the case, it might just be easier to say, I can explain this. God just hasn't selected them. But and it also makes me feel better. Well, he selected me. Right? He selected me, and I don't really have any free choice in it, but gee, I'm pretty special now. Okay. I'm speculating. I'm not a Calvinist, so I don't know what's in their head. Maybe it might be that they've never heard the other side. That could be the case. Maybe they haven't tuned into Soteriology 101.
Yeah. Well, I think if back when I was a Calvinist, I would think it was probably the latter. I hadn't really been introduced to the other side, and therefore I adopted that interpretation because it was the one introduced to me first, and so that's the reason that I adopted it. I don't think I ever had the motivation of being lazy or trying to avoid evangelism when I was a Calvinist. I don't ever remember that being a motivation, though it could be the motivation of some. I have no idea. We can't read the minds of Calvinists as to why they choose one particular interpretation over another. It's just been my experience in the time doing this that very few of, especially the young internet type Calvinists, have actually given time to really examine the deep theological, robust scholars from the other side. Yeah. They have mostly kind of surrounded themselves in an echo chamber of other Calvinists telling them what the other side believes. And that's one of the reasons they treat us like we're doofuses sometimes, is because they just assume that we're as dumb as the scholars and the leaders within their community are telling them about us. And that's one of the reasons I started the program, is to say, hey, there's some really sharp guys like Dr. Turek and many, many others who do not hold to a more deterministic reading of the text. And this is where I think the rubber meets the road when it comes to apologetics. You mentioned this just now about the motivation to do apologetics. If you believe God is ultimately deciding what the person you're talking to is going to decide with regard to their faith, then what motivates you to spend all day long, as Paul does in Acts chapter 28, trying to persuade them? What motivates you to go through all of the evidences instead of just saying, hey, Jesus died on the cross. If you would believe in him, you'll be saved, and just leaving it at that? I mean, if you're a Calvinist, you can obey the command to tell the good news, but not even get involved in apologetics. So that would be my big question, is what's the motivation of being an apologist to begin with, if you're going to adopt the Calvinistic system?
And I might add this too, Leighton, that if God, I think God gives us partially anyway, not to a full extent, but he gives us the dignity of causality. What do I mean by that? That God gives us the ability to affect not only time, but eternity with what we do. And if God does it all, then why are we even here? I mean, he doesn't need us to preach the gospel if he determines overrides the free will of human beings. He doesn't need us to do a thing, right? But he does, if we do have free will, he gives us the opportunity to actually affect time and eternity. I'm reminded of a debate years ago at Dallas Theological Seminary that my mentor, Dr. Norman Geisler, had with Dr. John Gerstner, who Geisler described as the reincarnation of Jonathan Edwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they were having a debate over this very issue. And according to Geisler, I never got Gerstner's side of it, but according to Geisler, here's what happened in one of the exchanges. Dr. Geisler turned to Gerstner, and of course, Geisler is giving our view, the fact that we're chosen but free, and Gerstner's the 5-point Calvinist, and he turns to Gerstner and he says, does man have free will? And Gerstner says, yes, well, man has free will to do what he desires, but
right.
God gives him the desires of his heart. And so Geisler turned to Gerstner and said, well, then who gave Lucifer the desire to sin? And Gerstner said, mystery. And Geisler said, contradiction. You see, even R.C. Sproul would, when he got to that point, he would just say mystery. And R.C. Sproul was one of the most brilliant philosophers out there. He would just say mystery, when the reality is it's a contradiction to say that God is all good, yet he gives his creatures the desire to do evil. He takes away their free will, the desire to do evil, and then they act on that. That's not the God of the Bible. That's Allah, okay? God is not essentially good. Whatever God does is good. That's Allah. That's voluntarism. That's not essentialism. There's no ground of goodness if the 5-point Calvinist God is the God of the Bible. That just results in a voluntaristic Allah. Whatever God does is good. So I've heard some people even describe the God of the 5-point Calvinist as Allah. Now, of course, they would push back on that and make some modifications somehow, but I think that's inevitably where it leads, Leighton. It leads to a God who's arbitrary.
I would love to get a record of that conversation between, do you know if it's recorded between Geisler?
I have no idea.
Gerstner?
This was probably, Geisler was there. When was he there? He was there in the 80s. So I don't know if it was recorded. I don't know if it was recorded on a cassette. You remember those? Yeah. You're not as old as
I'm
me.
old enough. I'm old enough to
that?
remember the cassettes. Yes, I'm quite.
Okay, maybe it was. Maybe it was on 8-track.
Yes, I used to get the Ligonier. I get the Ligonier tapes in the mail. The Ligonier from Ligonier Ministries from R.C. Sproul, and sometimes if they got caught in my thing, you had to get it with a pencil and fix it. That was your repair kit was a pencil. But yeah, that conversation is great because that's one I actually quote from Sproul and Piper, both appealing to the mystery of the first sin, because of that very point. Because the point I'm making is that they're kind of kicking the can down the road because they appeal to the same mystery we do with regard to free will. They just appealed to it earlier on, and that's one of the reasons that stricter Calvinists or higher Calvinists they come right out and say God is the one who determined Adam's sin and in the garden is just like Lucifer's sin. They'll just come right out and say it. Because they recognize the inconsistency of that kind of position.
Well, we might say he determined it, but he didn't cause it.
Right.
We say that
causal determination. Yeah. Well, determining in the sense of, and this is where some people get into the semantics of what is determinism and what is causal determination versus allowing something to happen. Obviously, you can say he determined to allow something to happen. In other words, he determined for a person to make a free choice. I love what is A.W. Tozer's quote where he says something, God in his sovereignty did not determine which choice you'll make, but that you'll be free to make it. Therefore, when you make a free choice, you're not countervailing the sovereign will of God, but actually fulfilling it insofar as he's not determining your choice, but that you'll be free. And a God less than sovereign would be afraid to grant creatures that amount of freedom because he wouldn't know how to handle it. And I'm paraphrasing, but basically he made the same argument that you were making earlier is I think our view of sovereignty is much higher than that of the determinist perspective of a Calvinist, because ultimately God is having to play both sides of the chessboard in order to ensure his victory versus God's just better at chess than all of his opponents. And that's how we know he's going to win, because he's just better at chess. No matter what moves his opponents make, he's always going to be able to accomplish his purpose through their free choices. And like you were arguing earlier.
Let me go back to your question, because there's another implication to this. You asked, what are the implications of being an apologist and being a Calvinist? For me, I've noticed that when Calvinists who are apologists try and answer questions regarding evil, they can't give a robust answer, because someone who believes as we do that man has free will, that God still chooses, but we still have free will. We still choose as well. We're chosen but free. We can answer the problem of evil in a much more robust manner. They can't. People will ask, well, why did God allow Satan to sin? And the Calvinists will say, well, they're going to have to say, well, God didn't just allow it. He wanted him to sin. He gave him the impetus to sin, like he gives us the impetus to sin and the impetus to choose him. So someone who believes in free will can say the reason God allows evil is because he wants this to be a moral universe. So he gives us free choice. The only way we can love and make moral choices is if we have some sort of libertarian free will. But that opens up the possibility for us to do evil as well. And God thought it was worth having a moral universe. He thought love was worth giving people free will so they could love, but that opens up the possibility for evil. He could have made a robot world, which maybe I'm characterizing it too uncharitably, but that seems to me what Calvinism is, at least a hard 5-point version. He could have created a robot world where we really don't have free will, but it seems to me that's not a loving world. That's not a moral world. But God thought it was worth allowing free will so he could give us the ability to love, and he could solve the problem of evil by taking it upon himself. That he comes into this universe and allows the very creatures that freely chose to sin against him to torture and kill him so he could take their punishment on himself and then offer salvation back to them. That seems to make much more sense of the problem of evil than just saying, well, God determines all things, and it's a mystery as to why evil exists.